In 1895, a foal worth less than a single month's wages for a working rancher entered the world on a modest stock farm in central Illinois. More than a century later, that horse's bloodline would flow through the vast majority of American quarter horses alive today, coursing through an industry valued at more than $150 billion. His name was Peter McCue. The circumstances of his birth were humble, even by the standards of late 19th century American horse breeding. Samuel Watkins operated the Little Grove Stock Farm in Petersburg, Illinois, a town of fewer than 2,000 residents situated along the Sangamon River. The farm was respectable but unremarkable, standing 2 stallions for local breeders and producing horses suited for the agricultural and racing needs of the Midwest. On February 23, 1895, a dark bay colt was foaled from the thoroughbred mare Norm. Watkins claimed the colt was sired by his thoroughbred stallion Duke of the Highlands, a practical deception that would allow the young horse to race in recognized thoroughbred events. The Watkins family would later acknowledge the truth. Peter McCue was actually sired by Dan Tucker, a quarter-horse stallion whose bloodline traced to the legendary Shiloh. The distinction mattered. In 1895, there was no American Quarter Horse Association. There was no formal registry. There was only tradition, handed down through generations of horsemen who recognized that certain horses possessed an explosive speed over short distances that no thoroughbred could match. These were the quarter-milers, horses bred for the quarter-mile sprints contested on American soil since colonial times. Peter McCue was born into this world of informal knowledge and word-of-mouth reputation. His value at birth was minimal. A horse, after all, must prove himself. The infrastructure of modern breeding had not yet emerged. A stallion's worth depended entirely on what he could demonstrate under saddle, on the track, and eventually in the quality of his offspring. No one present at Little Grove Stock Farm that February morning could have predicted what would unfold. The mare and foal represented nothing more than the seasonal renewal of stock. Within 2 decades, however, this colt would change hands multiple times, travel across 4 states, and set in motion a genetic cascade that would reshape the economics of Western ranching. The story of Peter McCue is not merely a story of equine excellence. It is a study in exponential multiplication, in how a single exceptional specimen, born without fanfare on unremarkable ground, can propagate value across generations, across state lines, and across an entire century of American enterprise. Peter McCue matured into a specimen that defied the conventions of his era. At 16 hands tall and weighing over 1,400 pounds in racing condition, he towered over the typical quarter horse of his day. The standard bulldog-type sprinter stood closer to 14 hands and carried considerably less mass. Peter McCue was something altogether different, a fusion of power and speed that contemporary horsemen struggled to categorize. His physical architecture told the story. His stride covered remarkable ground at full extension. His hindquarters carried the explosive musculature necessary for violent acceleration from a standing start. His temperament was notably calm, a trait that would prove equally valuable on the racetrack and in the breeding shed. Horses that wasted energy on anxiety rarely performed at the highest levels, and Peter McCue conserved every advantage. When Charles Watkins, Samuel's nephew, placed the 2-year-old colt in race training in 1897, the results exceeded all expectations. Peter McCue recorded 8 wins in his debut season, competing at distances ranging from a half-mile to 4.5 furlongs. Milo Burlingame, a young jockey who would later become one of the stallion's owners, rode Peter McCue during a meet in St. Louis. Decades later, Burlingame recalled the experience with precision. "I never saw him raced with horses that could make him straighten his neck out." The quarter mile was Peter McCue's specialty. At that distance, contemporary accounts record him being clocked consistently around 21 seconds. In the context of late 19th century timing methods, this was an extraordinary performance. Coke Roberts, who would own the stallion in his final years, declared without qualification that Peter McCue was unquestionably the greatest sprinter and sire of short horses that ever lived. But speed alone does not explain Peter McCue's economic significance. What mattered to the ranchers and stockmen who would eventually seek his offspring was the practical application of that athletic ability. The American West of the 1890s and early 1900s operated on horseback. There were no trucks capable of navigating the rough terrain of Texas, Oklahoma, or Colorado. There were no all-terrain vehicles for checking fence lines across thousands of acres. The working ranch horse was not a luxury, it was essential infrastructure. A superior horse meant more cattle gathered per day, more miles covered per rider, more efficient operations across vast landscapes where labor was scarce and distances were measured in hours of travel. Peter McCue's physical traits translated directly into operational advantages. His size and strength allowed him to handle the heaviest roping work. His speed permitted rapid pursuit of breakaway cattle. His calm disposition meant fewer accidents, fewer injuries to riders, fewer disruptions to the daily rhythm of ranch work. And critically, his intelligence made him trainable, responsive, and predictable under the unpredictable conditions of open-range work. When ranchers began to recognize these qualities in Peter McCue's offspring, they understood something that transcended aesthetic appreciation. They understood productivity. A horse that could work harder, longer, and smarter than the average mount represented a direct increase in the economic output of a ranching operation. The stud fees paid to access Peter McCue's genetics were not expenses. They were investments with measurable returns. By 1907, when John Wilkins of San Antonio, Texas, purchased Peter McCue and brought him southwest, the stallion's reputation had already begun its westward migration. The transaction marked a turning point. Peter McCue was no longer an Illinois racehorse with regional recognition. He was entering the heart of American cattle country, where the quarter horse would find its truest purpose and its greatest economic expression. The mathematics of equine reproduction are straightforward. A stallion can breed dozens of mares in a single season. Each resulting foal carries half of that stallion's genetic material. If those offspring prove exceptional, and if the males among them enter service as breeding stallions themselves, the original sire's influence compounds across generations with a velocity that few other forms of biological investment can match. Peter McCue stood at stud in Illinois until 1907. He then stood in Texas under John Wilkins. 2 owners later, Milo Burlingame, the jockey who had once ridden him to victory in St. Louis, purchased the stallion in 1910 for $5,000 and brought him to Cheyenne, Oklahoma. In 1916, Burlingame sold Peter McCue to Coke Roberts of Hayden, Colorado, who would own the stallion until his death in 1923 at the age of 28. Across these years and these locations, Peter McCue bred hundreds of mares. The formal registry would eventually record only 44 of his direct offspring with the American Quarter Horse Association, but this number vastly understates his influence. The AQHA was not founded until 1940, 17 years after Peter McCue's death. By the time organized registration began, his descendants had already dispersed across the western states in numbers that defied complete documentation. The sons of Peter McCue became legends in their own right. Harmon Baker, Buck Thomas, who won 38 of 49 career starts, Hickory Bill, John Wilkins, Jack McCue, Badger, Eddie Reed. Each of these stallions carried their sire's genetic signature into new breeding programs, new ranches, new regions. The multiplication had begun. The grandsons extended the reach further still. Joe Hancock, sired by John Wilkins, became one of the most celebrated foundation sires in quarter horse history. These names would appear in pedigrees for decades to come, each one tracing back through the male line to Peter McCue. The connection to the great Texas ranches illustrates the magnitude of this genetic expansion. Hickory Bill, a son of Peter McCue, sired offspring that entered the breeding programs of operations throughout South Texas. The foundation bloodlines that would define American quarter horse breeding carried Peter McCue's genetic contribution, directly or indirectly, through multiple crossed lineages that spread across the cattle empires of the Southwest. The statistical evidence from the breed's formative years is telling. Of the first 11,500 quarter horses registered with the AQHA before January 1948, more than 2,000 traced their male lineage to Peter McCue through his sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons. This represented roughly 1 in 5 of all registered horses in the breed's early registry. No other stallion approached this concentration of influence. Traveler, the only competitor for foundational significance, accounted for fewer than 800 male line descendants in the same period. The geographic distribution matched the numerical dominance. Peter McCue's offspring worked cattle in the Texas Panhandle. They ran races in Oklahoma. They populated breeding programs in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. The trail drives had ended, but the quarter horse was only beginning its conquest of the American West, and Peter McCue's blood flowed through the veins of horses on ranches separated by hundreds of miles. By the time the American Quarter Horse Association consolidated its registry with the American Quarter Racing Association and the National Quarter Horse Breeders Association, the genetic foundation had been permanently established. Peter McCue was not merely one influential sire among many. He was the root system from which the modern quarter horse breed would grow, spreading outward across the continent like water finding its level across uneven ground. A rancher in West Texas saddles a sorrel gelding before dawn. He does not pause to consider the animal's pedigree. He thinks only of the cattle that need moving, the miles that need covering, the work that waits beyond the barn door. Yet the horse beneath him carries a genetic inheritance stretching back more than a century, to a dark bay stallion foaled on a modest farm in central Illinois. In 2023, the American quarter horse industry generated more than $150 billion in total value across the United States. Behind that figure lies the accumulated influence of foundation sires whose genetics shaped the breed. The industry supports more than 2 million jobs. It occupies tens of millions of acres dedicated to horse-related activities. These numbers represent a web of commerce touching nearly every state in the Union. The American Quarter Horse Association maintains records on more than 5 million registered quarter horses. The overwhelming majority trace their lineage directly or indirectly through multiple foundation lines, to Peter McCue. It is a concentration of genetic influence with few parallels in modern animal husbandry. The implications extend far beyond the horse itself. The quarter horse transformed the operational efficiency of American ranching during the critical decades of the early 20th century. Ranches that bred or purchased descendants carrying foundation bloodlines gained measurable advantages in cattle management. Those advantages compounded over time. Better horses meant more effective use of labor. More effective labor meant larger operations could remain profitable. Larger operations generated the capital necessary to acquire more land and breed more horses. The cycle reinforced itself across decades. The great Texas ranches understood this principle instinctively. The King Ranch, the Wagoner Ranch, the Four Sixes, and dozens of other legendary operations built their horse programs on foundation bloodlines shaped by Peter McCue and his contemporaries. The hundreds of thousands of acres these ranches managed, the tens of thousands of cattle worked by their horsemen, all depended upon horses bred for the specific combination of speed, strength, and temperament that Peter McCue had demonstrated a generation earlier. The connection between superior genetics and superior land management was direct and quantifiable. The racing sector amplified the financial returns. Quarter horse racing developed into an industry generating billions in wagering and purses. The explosive acceleration that Peter McCue demonstrated on Midwestern tracks in 1897 became the defining characteristic of a breed built for short-distance dominance. Modern quarter horses have been clocked at 44 miles per hour in sprint competition. The genetic architecture enabling such performance traces backward through generations to stallions whose remarkable acceleration set them apart from every competitor they faced. The show ring and working competitions contributed further value. Cutting, reining, roping, and ranch versatility events draw competitors and spectators who sustain local economies across the western states. The temperament and trainability that made Peter McCue's descendants valuable on working ranches translated into competitive dominance across disciplines that did not exist when he was foaled. Perhaps most significantly, Peter McCue's influence established the genetic architecture that would enable the quarter horse to adapt as American ranching evolved. The modern quarter horse works cattle on ranches equipped with trucks and helicopters. It competes in arenas with electronic timing systems. It serves recreational riders on suburban acreages and therapeutic programs in urban centers. Through every adaptation, the breed has maintained the fundamental characteristics that made Peter McCue exceptional: speed, strength, intelligence, and calm disposition under pressure. The stallion died on Coke Roberts Ranch in Colorado in 1923. He was 28 years old. He was inducted into the American Quarter Horse Hall of Fame in 1991, nearly 7 decades after his death. The recognition acknowledged what the breed's founders had understood from the beginning. Peter McCue was not merely a successful racehorse or a prolific sire, that he was one of the primary genetic cornerstones on which an entire industry would be built. At sunrise tomorrow, somewhere on the Texas plains, a young cowhand will swing into the saddle. The horse will respond to the slightest shift of weight, the gentlest pressure of rein. Together they will move cattle across ground that has been worked this way for more than a century. The rider may never learn Peter McCue's name. But the blood that moves beneath that saddle, the instinct that guides each pivot and sprint, traces back to foundation lines he helped establish. The multiplication continues. It will continue tomorrow and the day after, and for as long as horses work the American West. If these stories of Western heritage hold meaning for you, consider subscribing. The land remembers what the record books cannot fully capture, and there are legacies yet to be told.